Everybody. For the folks joining, we'll get started in about a minute. And then we can get started. Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ELI's 7th summer school session this year, Environmental Justice. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. Each summer, ELI convenes a complimentary seminar series that offers an introduction to the legal and policy foundations of environmental protection in the United States. This series is aimed at folks who do not already have a background in environmental law. It's an introductory course into the basics and foundational elements of environmental law. The end of our summer school series. Today's session is the last webinar of summer school. I also have an announcement about next week's in-person session of summer school. It was previously scheduled to be on hazardous waste and sites. However, it will now be a networking session. It will still be at the same time and at the same location at ELI's Washington, D.C. office. So if you're in the D.C. area, we hope you are able to make it. We are inviting all of our 2023 summer school speakers to attend, as well as members of ELI's board and leadership council. So this is sure to be a wonderful opportunity to network with experts in the field and to get to know others who attended the summer school series. We just made the decision to change things around a little bit this morning, so the website may not be updated yet, but it will be updated by the end of the day. So please register on ELI's website. You can register on the hazardous waste page if it's still listed as that. If you're interested in attending, there are still some spots left, but there's limited capacity for how many people can attend. So please do register if you're interested. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to us at events@eli.org. All sessions of summer school, except for next week's networking session, will be recorded and posted to ELI's website within a few business days of each event. If you've missed any previous sessions that took place earlier this summer, we encourage you to check them out now via our website. You can find each individual session on our website at eli.org. Now I will go ahead and kick things off for today's session. Today's session of summer school is focusing on an important topic, environmental justice. In a moment, I will hand things over to our wonderful moderator. She'll give some opening remarks, and then our 3 panelists will each present. After their presentations, we'll have a roundtable discussion followed by time to answer audience questions. So please feel free to submit your questions as soon as you think of them, but make sure to be using Zoom's Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's no need to wait until the end of the program. You can submit your questions as soon as you think of them. The chat function is also open. We encourage you to use this to converse with one another or to post your observations. However, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box so that our panelists can be sure to address them. With that, let's begin. I'm now going to introduce our moderator, Christine. Christine Abba is an environmental justice advocate who specializes in environmental health and sustainability. Her background includes several years of experience in the nonprofit sector, working on environmental housing, food justice, and civil rights issues. Christine has worked as a senior staff attorney in the environmental justice program at the New York Lawyers for Public Interest and as a regional director at the New York State Division of Human Rights. She began her career as a staff attorney in the Civil Division of the Legal Aid Society of New York. She was appointed to serve as a member of New York City's Environmental Justice and One NYC advisory boards. A dedicated educator and mentor, Christine has taught courses on environmental justice as an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Climate School and the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. Christine graduated magna cum laude from the City College of New York, and received her law degree from Duke University School of Law. She's a graduate of the New York City Environmental Law Leadership Institute and the Campaign School at Yale. So Christine, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Oh, you're muted, Christine.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Madison. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion on environmental justice. I first want to say that we truly appreciate your interest in today's discussion, and our goal today is to help to guide your understanding of the topic by providing some background on environmental justice, as well as an in-depth discussion about the way in which lawyers, advocates, and communities are engaging in making progress toward the goals of a clean and healthy environment, safe for all. These are certainly times of great progress in the environmental justice movement, times of great progress and also great promise, particularly as President Biden's administration has led significant programming requiring large-scale cooperation to implement the vision detailed in various executive orders. In April this year, for example, President Biden signed Executive Order 1496, which with an enhanced definition of environmental justice. We'll talk a bit about the definition and the importance of definitions during our talk today. But I wanted to highlight that this definition enhances and creates more inclusive considerations for people with disabilities, for people and with tribal affiliations. So we can see that there's definitely an evolution throughout this progress that I'm happy to be able to witness, and through this panel to share and impart some of our perspectives on this. So the executive order was widely reported and discussed, lending support to environmental justice campaigns and advocacy. So current attention to the environment is growing. I think we can all agree. Last month, the nation was gripped with air quality concerns over the particular matter, laden haze from the wildfires in California. In Canada, further evidence that environmental issues literally transcend borders. This week, reports of record high temperatures are felt across the globe. While such events affect everyone, it is very important and it's given people a chance to consider how the effects of extreme weather impact particularly vulnerable environmental justice communities. So through my work, I've learned that environmental justice is truly a collaborative and dynamic field that requires holistic thinking and encourages people to use such approach to address challenging problems. And I encourage people to focus on the resiliency of the community members of the affected communities while examining the legal and social issues that create the problems and challenges they face. And in this way, your advocacy remains people-focused and by necessity, community-led. So there are certainly ways that we can all support environmental justice communities, and your presence here today is certainly one of them. And with that, I want to introduce our esteemed panelists, beginning with Brittany Shar. Brittany Shar is an associate attorney in the Southern Environmental Law Center's Atlanta office, where she focuses her practice on environmental justice, coastal and climate resilience, and water quality across Georgia communities. Brittany graduated summa cum laude from Vanderbilt University and received her law degree from New York University School of Law, where she served as the editor-in-chief of the Environmental Law Journal. We're also joined today by Tanya Nesbitt. Tanya Nesbitt is a partner with the law firm of Thompson Hines. Tanya has an unprecedented track record as a nationally recognized formidable litigator who has litigated highly complex environmental matters. Her successes have earned her the distinction of Law Dragon 500's leading U.S. environmental lawyer. Tanya has represented small to sophisticated businesses in environmental permitting, natural resource and land management, and wildlife management in relation to federal public lands. Her experience includes working with the U.S. Department of Justice's Natural Resources Division, the Bureau of Land Management, and Forest Service in greater sage-grouse litigation, as well as working as an assistant United States attorney for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. Finally, we are joined by Jacqueline Patterson. Jacqueline Patterson is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. The mission of the Chisholm Legacy Project is rooted in a just transition framework. serving as a vehicle to connect Black communities on the front line of climate justice with the resources to actualize their visions. Prior to the launch of the Chisholm Legacy Project, Patterson served as the Senior Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program for over a decade. During her tenure, she founded and implemented a robust portfolio, which included several serving the state and local leadership whose constituencies consisted of hundreds of communities on the front lines of environmental justice. She also led a team in designing and implementing a portfolio to support political education and organizing work executed by NAACP branches, chapters, and state conferences. Welcome to all of our esteemed panelists. So we will begin today. I will provide you with a brief history of the environmental justice movement. I think that'll help to provide some context for our discussion. Then we'll move on to Brittany, who will discuss some of the current environmental justice federal initiatives. And then we'll proceed with our panel, and I'll continue to check and monitor the questions and answer box. So that way, if you have any questions, please, as they arise, please put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we review and provide you an opportunity to be heard. So, beginning with the history of the environmental justice movement. Now, the history of environmental justice is truly a convergence of various movements, ranging from the fight for healthy neighborhood environments and safe housing, demands for the reduction and elimination of toxins in the natural and built environment, and various labor-based struggles to protect employees, from farm workers to factory workers, from hazardous exposures and advocacy to increase the cost, access to healthy food and green spaces. Now, depending on how you approach a topic, you can find the roots of the environmental justice movement in land use, environment, and in air quality-based struggles across the country. It is widely agreed that the beginning of the environmental justice movement was sparked by the protests against the dumping of PCB waste in the community of Warren County, North Carolina, in 1982. And the organized protest brought together wide swaths of various demographics to support a predominantly African-American community from suffering the injustice of having their homes become a storage site for toxic waste. The media coverage truly helped to propel the issue into the national conscious, which amplified and articulated the conceptual underpinnings of the environmental justice movement. Now, the protest was exemplary in its result. It is important to note that the challenges faced by the communities in Warren County were very sadly similar to other challenges faced by communities across the country, and some of them that we're now learning about. Considering also that in 1982, similar struggles came to light in the far south side of Chicago, in the Altgeld Gardens community under the leadership of Hazel Johnson, officially incorporated her organization, People for Community Recovery, focusing on enhancing community awareness of the adverse effects of health effects of living in proximity to toxic waste. And her organization was founded in 1979. So you can see there's certainly an uptick of environmental organizing, which is really becoming more institutionalized in the late 70s and early 80s. And the protests in Warren counties were followed by the influential report commissioned by the United Church of Christ Racial Justice Commission on Toxic Waste and Race. And this was published in 1987 with the lead author being Charles Lee. In 1988, in Harlem, New York, Peggy Shepard, Bernice Travis, and supported by a strong community of activists, co-founded We Act for Environmental Justice to empower local residents who address environmental hazards faced by residents of West Harlem. They propelled their advocacy also through a lawsuit challenging facility siting. I'd like you to also consider in the history of environmental justice the community of Kettleman County in California, led by Luke Hull and his role in developing community lawyering methods, which continue to power environmental legal battles to this day. So the Kettleman community, represented by the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, and other advocacy groups, filed a lawsuit against the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. Now, taken together, And I'm just giving you some highlights of the very early parts of the environmental justice movement. We can see that the history of EJ was shaped and is still supported by committed local action. The EJ movement, which can be contextualized within the civil rights movement, began to grow into the formidable national and internationally recognized campaign that it is today, sparking government action and intervention. Consider that the United States EPA created an environmental equity working group in 1990, and then under the Bush administration in 1992, the EPA opened its Office of Environmental Justice. In 1994, President Clinton signed Executive Order 12898, Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations, which required environmental justice considerations to be factored into federal government decision-making. Now, there's a plethora of other activities, historic events that coincide with this really seminal time in the development of the environmental justice movement. And you can definitely see vestiges of the strength of the fight in today's new and developing advocates, which I'm very hopeful about the future for the movement. And I think this is a good place. I think we can segue into talking about, into speaking with our panelists today. So there are many other stories that I could share, which would certainly extend this brief introduction to the history of environmental justice. But one thing to keep in mind is that the history of the environmental justice movement is being written every day and through our collective concerns and our actions. So let's turn now to Brittany Shar as she will discuss more about the practice of environmental justice and its current direction. Brittany?
Thank you so much, Christine, for that great introduction to these issues. My name is Brittany Shar. I'm an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center in Atlanta, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to engage diverse stakeholders in the environmental justice process. And I'm going to mainly be talking about a case that I worked on last year involving a wood pellet plant in South Georgia. But before I get into all of that, I just want to give a brief overview of what environmental justice is and current federal policies related to environmental justice. So what do we mean when we say environmental justice? One definition that I often see cited by lawyers and policymakers and even state governments is the EPA's definition, which says environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So looking at this definition, it has two different components. It has fair treatment, which is sort of a substantive component, ensuring that environmental decision-making isn't disproportionately harming certain groups, and especially low-wealth communities of color that have been historically overburdened by pollution. And the second component is meaningful involvement, which is more of a procedural component. That means ensuring that communities and residents have the opportunities to have their voices heard during the environmental decision-making process. So, for example, if we had a landfill that was being sited in a majority Hispanic or Latino low-income community, meaningful involvement might look like the agency ensuring that public notices are translated into Spanish if the community is Spanish speaking. It might involve posting information about this permit and the permitting process and public hearings in places other than the internet, since not all households will have internet access. And I think most importantly, meaningful involvement really requires decision makers to take community members' concerns and opinions into account when they're making environmental decisions. So this is EPA's definition, but it's certainly not the only definition of environmental justice. And I wanted to call out the 17 principles of environmental justice, which were created during the first National People of Color Leadership Summit that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1991. And this summit brought together over 1,000 different environmental justice activists and community leaders. And one of the outcomes of this summit was the 17 principles of environmental justice. So the first principle is here on the slide, and it recognizes the sacredness of Mother Earth ecological unity, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Some of the other principles recognize the right to workplace safety and the right to be free from occupational hazards. They also recognize our responsibility as individuals to make sustainable choices so that there are resources left for future generations. So looking at these 17 principles, which I couldn't fit on this slide, it is a much broader view of environmental justice than what we saw in EPA's definition. And I think it's important to view the environmental justice field with this broader lens. And if you haven't seen these principles before, I definitely encourage you to look them up and take some time to read over them. One thing I think is really exciting about the environmental justice field is that it touches on so many different subject areas. And at its core, environmental justice really is a social justice issue. Like I said, ensuring that folks are not disproportionately harmed by pollution and other environmental stressors, but also making sure that all communities have access to equal resources and funding. It's also a huge public health issue, as we've seen time and time again, that low wealth communities of color are overburdened by pollution, and that leads to worse health outcomes like asthma, heart disease, different types of cancer. So the public health component is really important as well. Environmental science and climate change is a big component of this work, as climate change, for example, disproportionately impacts these same communities with increased incidences of extreme heat and extreme weather events. And I'll also just call out data and technology as a really important tool and important subject matter in environmental justice work. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about mapping and environmental justice mapping tools in my later slides. So going off the idea that this is a really interdisciplinary field, solutions to environmental justice problems really do require a broad range of perspectives and diverse stakeholders. And some of those stakeholders are listed here on this slide, but I really wanted to highlight the importance of EJ communities themselves, the residents that are actually experiencing these environmental harms and are seeing firsthand what's going on in their neighborhoods, because they really are the most important stakeholder in this work, and their needs should always be centered in environmental justice work. So just wanted to call out EJ communities as the most important stakeholder in this list, but there are many other groups and individuals that are involved in these decisions and these solutions. And I think as lawyers, it can be really easy to approach problems with sort of a problem-solving lens. You want to go in and see what the problem is and make recommendations. And in some fields, I think, people might want that, clients might want that, but in EJ work, I think it is really important to take a step back and make sure you are really listening to the community, what their problems are, what they've been experiencing, and what their goals are before offering solutions. And I also wanted to call out the Southeast Regional Environmental Justice Summit, which happened last month in Atlanta. This event was convened by Harambe House, which is an environmental justice organization based in Savannah, Georgia. And they convened this event with the goal of establishing a 10-year regional environmental justice action plan for the Southeast. And I think this is a really great example of a diverse set of groups, of stakeholders, of perspectives coming together to strategize around what environmental justice solutions we need in this region. So this was a 5-day event. It had representatives from environmental justice communities, community groups, federal government representatives from the EPA and the Department of Energy. It also had lawyers, nonprofits, and students and professors as well. So it was a really diverse group, and I think it's really important to have all of these people in one room listening to community issues, the most pressing things that are going on, and strategizing around what environmental justice should look like in the Southeast. And one really interesting point that came out of this summit is the fact that environmental justice communities often have a hard time taking advantage of all the funding opportunities that are available. And I will talk about this a little bit later in my presentation, but right now there are so many environmental justice funding opportunities coming from the federal government, coming from other organizations, and the application process can be burdensome, or even just keeping track of all of the opportunities that exist can be a lot of work. So that was a big theme in this summit, and strategizing around how to make sure communities are actually receiving the money that is intended to be benefiting them. So another thing that I think is interesting about the EJ space as a lawyer is that there is a lot of room for creative thinking in these types of cases. So the traditional litigation tools that you might think of when you think of EJ lawyering, some of which are listed on the left hand of this slide, those are really important, like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and of course, federal environmental statutes and citizen suits. Those are all really important tools, but I think equally important are the non-legal tools that are available. And I wanted to specifically highlight coalition building and relationship building in this type of work. And this is something I'll talk a little bit more about when I get into my case study, but building relationships and building coalitions can really help to gain traction around certain issues that communities are facing and really help to achieve good outcomes in these cases. And I'll also just call out GIS mapping as a really powerful tool in EJ work. And you might have heard of EJ Screen, which is the EPA's environmental justice mapping tool. And it helps you to look at a specific community and see how that community stacks up against the state and the entire country in terms of all of these different environmental stressors. So this is just a quick screenshot I grabbed from the area around Lindsay Street Park in Southwest Atlanta, which, as you can see from this graph, hopefully it's not too small to read, but this community is really overburdened in every single category of environmental justice indexes that appear here. So particulate matter, toxic releases to air, traffic proximity, lead paint, Superfund sites. This community bears more of a burden from these environmental issues than at least 75% of other communities in the state and in the US. And in a lot of cases, it looks like close to 100%. So tools like EJ Screen can be really, really important in this work. And in, first of all, identifying what all of the burdens are and just how overburdened a community is compared to others, but also to tell a really compelling story to a court or to policymaker about why these issues are important. So now I'm going to turn to some recent federal initiatives related to environmental justice. And the first one here is Executive Order 14008 on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And President Biden signed this executive order his first week in office, and it established a number of different environmental justice initiatives, one of which is the White House EJ Advisory Council, or WEJAC, which is a group of 25 environmental justice community leaders and activists who meet regularly to discuss these issues and advise the president and CEQ on environmental justice issues. This executive order also launched the Justice40 Initiative, which says that 40% of all federal investments in a number of categories, including climate change initiatives, clean transportation, clean energy, and affordable housing, among others, 40% of the benefits from those programs must go towards disadvantaged communities. And defining what disadvantaged communities means has been a really hot topic in this space. And the White House recently launched the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CJUST, which is aimed at helping to define and identify disadvantaged communities. So as it currently exists, the CJUST tool uses a number of different environmental factors along with income level to designate a census tract as disadvantaged for purposes of Justice 40. Both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act contain provisions related to environmental justice funding under Justice40. And like I mentioned before, there are a lot of funding opportunities and grant opportunities available right now, which is really exciting. But we need to make sure that these funds are actually being received by the communities that need it most. Whereas, you know, a big city or large organization might be able to have more resources to review these opportunities, to submit applications, but we want to make sure the funds are also reaching all environmental justice communities. So I wanted to call out this Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, these TICTACs, which EPA and the Department of Energy recently announced. And these technical assistance centers are aimed at filling some of these gaps and helping communities to navigate the grant process, prepare grant applications, navigate the federal websites related to available grants, and also to manage grant funds once they receive them. They can also do things like help translate or interpret if communities need that, and help moderate meetings. So I think this is going to be a really valuable resource for EJ communities, and I'm excited to see how that initiative really helps. And then finally, I wanted to touch on Executive Order 14096 on revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice. And Christine touched on this as well in her opening remarks. But I do want to reiterate, this executive order redefined environmental justice. And as you can see here, it recognizes a right to clean air, clean water, safe and healthy foods. And it defines the environment as wherever people live, play, work, learn, grow, and worship. So I think that's really important. First of all, to recognize the environment is not just our natural environment, which is what we think a lot of the time, but it's also our built environment, our social environment, every part of our lives. And just recognizing the complexity of this issue, the access to safe and healthy foods is important. It mentions climate resilience. So I think this is a really important step in reframing our view of environmental justice and pushing these initiatives forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to my co-panelist, Tanya, to talk about how companies are responding to some of these EJ policies.
Thank you, Brittany. My name is Tanya Nesbitt. I'm a partner in the Environmental and ESG Collaborative at Thompson Hine, and I will be speaking today on the business case for environmental justice. Next slide, please. So this is certainly not an exhaustive list, and I should also preface my remarks by saying that I think environmental justice now encompasses other things like energy justice and climate justice. So we're using, or I intend to use, an umbrella term, but certainly we have, I think, reached a point in our history where we can't unring the bell. And so businesses that care about being good corporate stewards and citizens have to incorporate these considerations in their work. There are also arguments made that for corporations that perhaps contributed to pollution and climate change in the past, this sort of restoration should be part of their efforts, and it's the right thing to do. Aside from that, I think that we're also reaching a time in our history where climate change is no longer a thing that only certain communities experience. You're really hard pressed nowadays to find a community that is no longer impacted by climate change. Corporations also too are interested in being profitable and making money. And so when climate change impacts their business, that's something that they have to contend with. And so there's a business case, obviously, for being able to contribute to the amelioration and building climate resiliency as part of having a viable business. Additionally, there are obviously financial benefits to the business being able to reach its business objective, if it's to build factories, plants, etc., depending on the business. And so if you have a community that is open and receptive, and you have state level government that is receptive to that. You've been able to build those relationships and engage in the manner that Brittany just spoke about. You have a net gain of obviously being able to reach your business objectives, and that's hard to do if you didn't do the work that you needed to do and your permits end up denied. In addition to the business objectives, we'll talk about ESG in a little bit, but we're also seeing stakeholders that are demanding companies to speak and think about these issues as part of their work. And so it can be very damaging to a brand or a business's reputation if they have not done their homework and are going against what community needs or continues to contribute to perhaps some of the public health challenges associated with climate change. We're also seeing and saw really during COVID that communities that are vulnerable to environmental impacts also had significant increased risks for things like COVID. We're seeing connections between environmental impacts and things like maternal mortality rates, particularly in African American communities. So I think there are a lot of sort of offshoots and connections here in how companies have to think about stakeholder interest and engaging their communities. And lastly, obviously, there's litigation risk. You have it from federal government, from state government, and also from citizen groups that are becoming more creative, as Brittany said, in thinking of ways to bring lawsuits, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Next slide, please. So Brittany spoke about this, so I won't go into great detail. But we typically will advise corporations when they are at the very infancies of their business planning to have an accurate understanding of the communities in which they're impacting or engaging with. And so the primary tools to do so, as Brittany mentioned, are EJ Screen and the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. The Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool also has a dual purpose to be used by the administration under the Justice40 Initiative to deliver 40% of the overall benefits in benefits of investments in climate, clean energy, and related areas to disadvantaged communities. So I think companies tend to primarily look at EJ Screen as kind of what EPA is looking at in terms of potential enforcement actions. EJ Screen has 13 environmental indicators, 7 socioeconomic indicators, 13 EJ indices, and 13 supplemental indices. Again, I think lots of back and forth, I think, with EPA, particularly on EJ Screen and its effectiveness. There are gaps. It's not a perfect tool, but I think something that companies can use to get a better sense of and orient themselves as to what communities are they working with and how these communities may already be overburdened by environmental impact. Next slide, please. So something I wanted to point out, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, this is essentially the main hook for complaints, administrative complaints, but also EPA enforcement action against businesses that are recipients of federal financial assistance. As Brittany pointed out, there are obviously other mechanisms if a business is not in compliance with its current permitting, like a clean air permit under the Clean Air Act, that could also have ramifications. We're seeing plaintiffs as well get creative and craft public and private nuisance claims as a driver to get relief from courts. This particular portion of Title VI is under the responsibility, obviously, of the EPA Office of Civil Rights, but it hangs in the balance a little bit given the recent Supreme Court decision in the Harvard admissions case, as we saw Justice Gorsuch in the concurrence talk a bit about Title VI, and I think there understandably questions as to how high of a burden do plaintiffs have to reach in terms of proving intentional discrimination. And so it's unclear how it will be used and litigated in the future after that case. Next slide, please. So one point I just had in my notes also on Title VI is that in the last 2.5 years, we've seen that EPA has investigated about 16 Title VI complaints in 9 states, and the investigations have ranged in industries, including concrete, waste incinerator facilities and plants, petrochemical plants, water utilities, asphalt plants. So it's a pretty wide array of industry. And I think a lot of that activity certainly because of the Biden's administration's whole of government approach and commitment to this issue. And so it'll be interesting to kind of see how that dovetails with what will happen after this recent Supreme Court ruling. So another place that we see environmental justice in the corporate lens is with the environmental and social governance movement. Next slide, please. So ESG, the 3 initials, environmental, social, and governance. Environmental are sort of the things we might think of as traditionally environmental work. So looking at emissions, looking at water-intensive operations, anything dealing with hazardous or toxic waste. Looking at what percentage of products are actually sustainable, what can be recyclable. The social is very broad, but can range from anything like environmental justice to diversity and inclusion, employee retention, wellness. And the G stands for governance and relates to board oversight of these types of issues, stakeholder management, risk mitigation. What are you putting in your corporate statements? Can you verify those things? And I always say really across the 3 are the greenwashing or climate washing, which people refer to. So can you substantiate the environmental benefit claims or the DEI claims or the environmental justice claims that you are telling your shareholders or sharing with the public? Next slide, please. So we also talk about emissions, obviously, as part of ESG, and scope 3 emissions, particularly probably being the most challenging for businesses to capture, but typically what a business is doing in terms of monitoring and regulating and capturing data related to its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is part of the E. And so looking at the upstream activities related to a business's sale of goods and services, the waste generation in a company's operation, things like business travel as well, are part of, should be part really of a company's ESG framework. Next slide, please. So these are just examples of ESG and sustainability projects. So looking at zero waste to landfill could be an example of a ESG initiative that a company could institute. Same with things like water quality and conservation. Looking at obviously recyclability and plastics is another big one. EJ considerations could also be another example of an ESG project or initiative that a company could look into starting and interacting with the communities that it's impacting. Next slide, please. So in the business sense, we're seeing that for a while, ESG really was the favorite child and getting a lot of attention and conversation. And environmental justice was sort of being discussed perhaps in separate silos as this separate thing. But I think that tide is ending, hopefully, and the 2 really do have to interrelate and intermarry. And so if a company has a robust ESG program, it is only robust if it does incorporate environmental justice components and considerations as part of that. And then again, I think Stakeholder demand also is driving those things in that direction as more reporting and performance requirements are expanding. Companies are getting questions and getting pressure to move in these areas. The same thing with mandatory disclosures. We talk a lot about clean energy and clean tech, and how is the country going to be able to make that shift and turn to get off fossil fuel dependency, and seeing that things like batteries and particular minerals are going to be very key to that transition. And so if those things are not being sourced ethically, if those things have forced labor, that is going to be a conflict, obviously, to the business's sort of ESG strategy. And the same goes with the ability to access government funds in programs, for example, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a monumental piece of legislation and the first of its kind, and the first time a federal statute actually codified and referenced environmental justice. But you have a number of programs and a huge pot of money intended to be spent to ameliorate the effects of environmental justice and to build climate resiliency in communities that perhaps were previously ignored. And so the emphasis there is to help businesses partner with communities and on the local level to get things like solar panels put on schools, perhaps in communities that were historically EJ communities, or to improve air quality in schools and perhaps communities that had particular problems historically with air pollution. And so being able to access those funds requires these types of considerations and obviously community engagement. And so as I mentioned earlier, there are tremendous financial benefits that this administration has created for companies to become engaged and pay attention and do the work to correct and ameliorate some of these problems. Next slide, please. So potential hurdles, you hear a lot that there is sometimes uncertainty as to whether a community is in fact environmentally burdened vis-a-vis the EJ screen software. And there are times where people have gone back and forth, even with EPA, about the issue where it's very unclear. There are also some concerns that because the administration did not use race as a consideration in these tools or softwares, are we in fact getting the right answers in terms of who is overburdened and how additional development or federal dollars, state funding may be able to ameliorate those impacts. So there is some uncertainty in that work. There is still a lot of uncertainty in terms of who is going to be able to compete for IRA grants and monies. There still needs to be a lot of work done in terms of formalizing actual applications, making sure that if we are to incorporate local level, community members who have been doing this work and obviously know these issues the very best, how can we make them have the tools and be competitive essentially to write the grants to be able to access these dollars and partner with businesses. And so there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of federal guidance very much still needed on these issues. And so that sort of hangs in the balance. I spoke earlier about the Harvard admissions case, and so that I think leaves a lot of uncertainty as to how Title VI may be used in the future and how we may be able to use race in the future to ameliorate the historic legacy conditions and effects caused by communities traditionally being overburdened by the impacts of environmental justice. We also have our own personal blind spots. And as I mentioned, I think a lot of companies that have robust ESG programs have been a bit slower to move on environmental justice considerations. And so that blindness oftentimes will affect those outcomes. And so if you don't have diverse board members or diverse members who have the company leadership and support to be able to direct some of these initiatives and make it an enterprise-wide issue, you can make policies and business decisions that have not been fully equitable in terms of the impacts they're going to have on the communities in which the business operates. And then lastly, greenwashing, of course. I think as the stakes get higher and higher in terms of today's consumer, if it's a business that is selling products, I think that people are at jeopardy and at risk of obviously greenwashing or green hushing. But the risk of not being able to substantiate fully the bona fides of whatever the benefits are the company intends to claim can be particularly high and risky. And obviously, greenwashing can be negligent. It doesn't have to be necessarily a bad actor. But those pitfalls and risk, I think, become much higher as the stakes for ESG continue to increase. Next slide, please. And so just some best practices. Typically, I think that if you are just starting to engage the local community when you are thinking of development or expanding, that already is too late. So I think, community engagement really should be a day one effort, and understanding that perhaps if the company has not always operated in a way that was positive or perceived as positive in the community's eyes, there's going to be some trust that has to be rebuilt. And so thinking strategically about ways to engage in philanthropy with local schools like the junior colleges or the high schools, thinking of ways of starting strategic community campaigns and partnerships, that should be part of ongoing work. And those relationships then should already be in place before you are thinking of coming to talk to the community about really sort of your business operations in a deeper sense. The same goes with engaging with local politicians and knowing what's going on in the local zoning board. There are obviously many layers to this onion, and so you need to think about what is going to be sort of the overall trajectory of whatever the business is planning. And so again, being aware of blind spots, you want to make sure that your local politicians have visited your site and understand your operations long before, again, you have a permit pending. Same thing with the local zoning board. We've seen cases where that has been the last step for approval, and companies have unfortunately stumbled on that step because they didn't take the time to sort of understand how the zoning board worked or build those relationships to get the business initiative sort of across the threshold. On a local level, obviously equipping sort of who is running the business to be your community ambassador and making sure that that is somebody who has a high emotional intelligence and has the ability to sort of be the evangelist for whatever the project is or whatever your business function is in the local community, and can build those relationships from the ground up. The same thing applies to sort of relying on trade associations or businesses like yours who are doing the same kind of work, who are facing similar issues and challenges, using them as a sounding board and tool to help establish best practices and learning from each other and seeing sort of what works and what doesn't work. We've seen clients also have really great success with developing internal and external environmental justice councils. Again, another forum for companies to share ideas, what works, what hasn't worked. Obviously, this space is changing and developing rapidly, and so that is another great way, in addition to the trade association, to have your finger on the pulse of what is going on. And lastly, I think it's important to understand really what the community wants and needs. ESG and EJ are very hot button terms these days, very topical, very newsworthy items. And so sometimes you have people that can come into a community that can represent this is what the community wants, but they're not members of that community themselves or have not taken the time to talk to people who are members of that community themselves. And so I think it's really important for the companies to cut through and understand sort of who the actual community is and what their needs and wants are. And that goes back, I think, to my first point, which is you should already be engaged with that and know who those individuals are before you, again, have to come to the community to sort of burden them with whatever your business objective is. And so relationships, I think, are very critical and important in this work. And I think it's really key now that we've reached a pivotal time in our country's history where businesses should be thinking about these issues as part of their day-to-day initiatives. And I guess I'm going to hand it over next to Brittany.
Well, Tanya, you do have a few questions, maybe before we get to Brittany, if you would like to answer. One of the questions from the audience asked a bit about Title VI investigations. If you could talk a little bit about that.
I didn't prepare any case studies of the 16 examples, but I think one of the probably most topical ones is the EPA investigation and eventual litigation related to Cancer Alley in Louisiana, which was a particular part of Louisiana where there had been some legacy pollution for several decades, I believe. And there are many others. Examples across the country, and I don't know if Brittany's example it will be a Title VI, but typically the EPA will engage in an investigation before it files a complaint in federal court, and so with the Cancer Alley investigation, which had gone on for quite some time, I believe a few months ago the EPA decided that it was going to not proceed with litigating the case, and I think there are varying viewpoints as to why that might have happened. I think some feel the position that Louisiana took in terms of defending the administration strategy of using Title VI, I think, as a vehicle to ameliorate historic based state, race-based discrimination with respect to the pollution, perhaps was a driver in pushing the administration off. I mean, I think you could ask many people and probably get a different answer, but that's one such example, and you can certainly look into it a bit more.
Thank you, Tanya. That's a great response. And another question from the audience spoke a little bit about their interest in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and perhaps you can give some maybe perspective on how that connects to environmental justice.
Yeah, so I think just holistically, look at, the ESG community has developed different frameworks to be able to look at a business's contribution, essentially, of greenhouse gases through its business operation. And so essentially scope 1 and 2 emissions are emissions directly tied to the business operation or the business function, and scope 3 more so directly relate to sort of the use of products or materials that are maybe not as directly created. So tracking emissions as part of things like business travel, things like your products and services, as opposed to looking at, if I'm building widgets in a factory plant and I am using mechanisms that release greenhouse gases, that would go into my scope 1 and 2 emissions. I had just a really good question, I guess, on client receptivity to some of these issues, and I would just have to say that, like anything, it certainly varies. I mean, I speak to in-house counsel who always say that I can't use the word environmental justice. I had to sort of reframe the work as community engagement, perhaps, to make it more palatable, because there are folks that see environmental justice work as this area of law that is perhaps off-putting. Then there are clients that don't understand it and are trying to wrap their heads around it, and then there are clients that are very engaged, have done the homework, have gotten up to speed, and want to engage even more than their current level. So I think some of it is meeting the client where they are and sort of understanding how to make the business case for the operations. As I mentioned in the presentation, I think most businesses nowadays are going to be impacted by climate change the same way that most communities are. And so perhaps starting there, if you are not before a receptive audience, can be useful.
Thank you so much. And with that, we can turn to Brittany as she talks more about her experience and a very interesting case study to share.
Thank you. Yes, now I'm going to turn to a case that I worked on involving a wood pellet facility in South Georgia. And this case was really interesting because the Georgia Environmental Protection Division permitted this wood pellet facility, which at full capacity would be the largest wood pellet facility in the world. They permitted this facility in this community called Adel, Georgia, which is in South Georgia, about 150 miles south of Macon. And just 1 year prior, EPD, the Environmental Protection Division, had permitted another wood pellet plant in the same community. So this was the second such facility in this community within a span of a couple of years. And this is a community that is already really overburdened by all sorts of industrial pollution. And so our case was arguing against the air quality permit that the Georgia Environmental Protection Division issued to this plant. So you might be wondering why a wood pellet plant is such a problem. And wood pellets are burned for fuel, and they're a type of biomass. And ideally, you can create wood pellets from wood scraps and sawdust and different things that otherwise wouldn't be used. And, that could be considered sustainable. But unfortunately, realistically, the demand for these wood pellets is so high that the industry has relied on clear cutting a lot of really mature forests across the Southeast to produce these wood pellets. And these wood pellet production facilities release a lot of pollutants into the air, hazardous air pollutants, nitrogen dioxide, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, all sorts of things which can be harmful to human health. And as you can see on this map, this is a really large industry across the Southeast. There are already 28 large-scale pellet plants across this region, with at least 10 more planned or in production. And the EJ issue is that these facilities are most often located in low-wealth communities of color. And I saw one statistic that said in 2018, every single wood pellet facility in North and South Carolina was located in a low-wealth community of color. So this is a big environmental justice concern in this region. And the other factor to think about is a lot of the demand for these wood pellets is actually coming from overseas, from Europe and the UK, because they have subsidies in place for this type of fuel. So this region is cutting down trees, siting these facilities in vulnerable communities, and then largely shipping these wood pellets overseas to fuel international demand. So I want to talk a little bit about the community that was involved in this case. Adel is a small town. It has a railroad track going through the town, and on the west side of the tracks is the majority Black and Hispanic or Latino community, and that's a low wealth community. And on the east side of the railroad tracks is a relatively higher income white community. And on the west side, which is the community of color, there is a lot of industry. There's a lot of industrial facilities, all different kinds. And that's something that you don't see on the east side of town. So even before this pellet plant was permitted, this is a community that already suffered from a lot of environmental stress. And pictured on this slide is Dr. Gear, who is a really important advocate for this community. She grew up in Adel, and she is the founder and director of Concerned Citizens of Cook County, which is the community group that we represented in this case. And I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of that group, but just to give you a little more insight into what this community is like, pictured here are a couple of the other industrial facilities in this community. There's a propane tank recycling business that in the process of their operations, they flare these propane tanks and release harmful gases into the environment, foul odors. There's also a Bitcoin mining operation, which is pictured on the right-hand side of the screen. And this is a huge operation that requires these industrial-sized fans that keep the machinery at a specific temperature. And these fans are running at all times of the day and night. They produce a lot of noise. Residents nearby say they can't even open their windows because it's so loud. They can't use their outdoor spaces. And the Bitcoin mining operation also uses a ton of energy. I think it's more energy than the rest of the town uses combined. So again, this community is experiencing a lot of pollution. Folks in the community will say they buy bottled water to brush their teeth and to cook with because their water smells like rotten eggs. Some folks say, on their street, they can't think of a single house that doesn't have someone who's had cancer. So that is kind of the context we're working in here when we talk about this wood pellet facility. So the stakeholders in this case were concerned citizens of Cook County, like I mentioned, also called 4C. This is the community group we represented, and they were really instrumental in the outcome in this case. Dr. Gear, who was pictured a couple slides ago, is a really great advocate for her community and did an amazing job at reaching out to all of these different organizations and building these relationships that helped gain attention for this issue. Spectrum Energy is the pellet plant, and as I'll discuss in a few slides, they actually became really instrumental in the outcome in this case as well. The Georgia Environmental Protection Division issued the permit here. And then there was a whole suite of nonprofits that really helped in this outcome by providing resources, whether it was financial or research support. And there's one I wanted to call out in particular. Georgia Conservation Voters, they produced this really great documentary about ADEL. It's called Abandoned, and it's on YouTube. I highly recommend you watch it if you're interested in learning more. But this documentary actually came out even before this pellet plant was permitted, just chronicling all of the environmental injustice that is present in the ADEL community. And Dr. Gear also had a big role in making this happen. So I want to touch quickly on what our legal claims were in this case. We brought air quality claims and environmental justice claims, but I'm just going to focus on the EJ claims here. So EPA has regulations that implement Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and those regulations say a recipient shall not use criteria or methods of administering its program or activity which have the effect of subjecting individuals to discrimination because of their race, color, national origin, or sex. And when it says recipient, it's talking about recipients of federal funding. In our case, it was the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. So what's interesting about this regulation is, unlike Title VI, which prohibits intentional discrimination, this EPA regulation prohibits discrimination that has the effect of discrimination on a community. So what we argued in this case was, first, that the Environmental Protection Division violated its obligation to ensure its permitting process was not discriminatory. This agency didn't do any sort of analysis on the cumulative impacts in this community, potential disparate impacts of its action, nothing like that. And their position was that they are not required to. And we were arguing that there's no certain way that you need to analyze these issues, but to comply with this EPA regulation, you need to do something to ensure that your procedures are non-discriminatory. And then we also claimed that in this case, the permit that was issued was actually discriminatory. It did discriminate against the Black and Hispanic residents in ADEL. It didn't protect public health. And there were a lot of technical provisions, but basically, the Environmental Protection Division was going to allow this pellet plant to operate for 120 days to gather data on what the emissions would be instead of figuring out beforehand what kind of pollutants and how much of each pollutant would be released into the air. So we argued that that, along with other permit conditions, had the effect of discriminating against the Black and Hispanic residents in ADEL that were already, like I said, very overburdened by pollution. So we were all ready to go to a hearing in this case. We were in administrative court in Georgia, but we were approached by the pellet company Spectrum to discuss a potential settlement agreement. And the settlement process was really interesting. It involved the CEO of Spectrum, who is Canadian, flying down to Adel, Georgia, and sitting in a room at a table face to face with the residents of this community. And that was so important for this community to finally have their seat at the table, have their voices heard, and be able to voice their concerns to the leadership of this company and have them listen and take their concerns into account and actually change their plans and their behaviors based on community concerns. So we did end up reaching an agreement in this case, and it did a lot of things. Most importantly, it created stronger public health protections beyond what the permit would have required. It also has really strong enforceability provisions. So the community itself can enforce the conditions of settlement agreement. And if the facility violates some of the conditions, they will have to pay into a community health fund. It's $25,000 per violation. Or if they're emitting past certain limits, they'll have to scale back production so as to not continue to emit that level of pollution. This agreement also created a lot of transparency between the community and this facility. It involves a requirement that the facility report out directly to the community group on its emissions data, which otherwise wouldn't be required, and they have to do that monthly. Another really big part of this settlement agreement is the community participation component. The agreement requires Spectrum to host 2 public meetings a year where community members can come and talk to leadership of the facility, and also creates a public hotline that community members can call with concerns. And it also sets in place requirements on how long the facility can take to respond to these concerns. And then finally, under this agreement, Spectrum agreed to pay for air monitors and air filters for the community that are to be installed in vulnerable areas around the town, like daycares and schools and churches and homes. So overall, this was a really great result for this community. Litigation can be really uncertain, and with this agreement, we ensured that the community would have greater public health protections than our state agency would have required otherwise. So in terms of next steps for this case, we are continuing to serve as an advisor to the Adel community, and we will help them enforce the terms of the settlement agreement once the facility is operational, which it's not yet. We also filed a Title VI complaint with the EPA, and that complaint isn't related to this facility or this case in particular. It's related to Georgia Environmental Protection Division's processes around permitting. Like I mentioned before, they don't do any sort of discrimination analysis or EJ analysis in their permitting, and we are arguing that that violates Title VI. And then finally, we will continue our advocacy against the wood pellet industry, which is a big EJ issue in the Southeast. Thank you all so much. I'll turn it back over to Christine.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting case study. And I think it really highlights some of the concerns that communities have as we talk about moving towards cleaner sources of energy and the things that we need to do in order to have a fair and just and robust transition to help all communities. But as you can see, that there are effects that sometimes are unnoticed. So thank you to you and your organization for really bringing that this struggle to the forefront and for your continued advocacy on this topic. And in consideration of just transitions, it'd be a great time to turn to our final panelist, Jackie Patterson, and we're looking forward to hearing her presentation as she discusses just transitions.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So yeah, I will talk about just transitions and what's called just transition lawyering. And so this is a bit of a hard to read schematic, which I'll kind of talk through around what just transition is, to just kind of ground us in the definition as it relates to a definition that was developed by frontline climate justice and environmental justice communities. And so this kind of collective of communities had a series of consultative processes that resulted in the development of this definition, which is really shifting from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, recognizing that extractive economies are mired in the concentration of wealth and power, militarism, and so forth. And also, it really talks about displaced democracy as it relates to our political system. But when we're shifting to a regenerative economy, it's rooted in values and practices around regeneration, recognizing that the Earth's systems were divinely designed in a way that all the needs that we have for energy, for water, for food, and so forth are part of this kind of natural infrastructure of our ecosystem. But what the challenge that we've had is when we've gone against the laws of nature, which we do on a regular basis. Also, the regenerative economy talks about being rooted in principles around cooperation, around ecological and social well-being, around caring for the sacred, meaning our relationship with each other, our relationship with the earth. And then it definitely centers deep democracy, so an inclusive economy. So next slide. Should I be doing this? Okay, good. So as we talk about shifting from the extractive economy to a regenerative economy, there are a number of folks who are doing this work, and that's what this is what we wanted to share about in terms of the Just Transitioning Lawyering Initiative, and some of the folks who are really stepping forward to do this work. So the Just Transition Lawyering Initiative really pulled together a group of folks from University of California, Irvine, from the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Poverty, and the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and now the Chisholm Legacy Project, and also Taproot Earth, which is the evolution of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Poverty. And so together we put together a framework in terms of this training program and a support for lawyers who want to really engage around just transition lawyering. And then now Taproot Earth is anchoring in an ongoing network for lawyers who come through the Institute and want to be a part of a collective cohort who are advancing just transition lawyering, who are supporting each other as peers. And so some of the people who have gone through the Just Transition Lawyering Institute include VOLAR, the Village of Love and Resistance. So they do work at the community level in Baltimore. The National Black Food and Justice Alliance went through the Just Transition Lawyering Institute. Full Spectrum Labs, which does work around moving large sums of capital and putting large sums of capital in the hands of frontline communities, so that we're not just kind of giving communities pennies and expecting transformation, that we're actually talking about a major shifts in capital. So next slide. And so, oh yeah, so this is just more on each of those. So in Baltimore, the Village of Love and Resistance is co-creates cooperative communities in East Baltimore, and it's led by and for Black and Brown people. And again, their idea is to build cooperative community through reclaiming land and really centering healing justice and building a base of community power. And so through VOLAR, there's our actual general counsel, they call themselves movement general counsels, and they're a solidarity law firm. So they work with the Village of Love and Resistance to develop to support them in developing the cooperative community, because it's one thing to kind of have a value around cooperation, but it often requires agreements to ensure that we have on paper and a clear understanding of what it means to act cooperatively, what it means in terms of the values, operational values for a cooperative, and what it means in terms of decision making and power, even within a cooperative, because those things exist, regardless of what structures we put together. So next slide. The the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. Similarly, they needed legal support to develop their various mechanisms for how they operate. They're again a national group that is that really connects between Black land institutions around the United States, and again deepening collective strategy towards regional and national Black land retention, protection, and recovery. We all know, unfortunately, the kind of epidemic of Black land loss. And so in order to be able to reclaim and hold on to land, certainly legal support has been critical in terms of even land theft instances that have happened. And again, making sure that people are resilient to displacement and loss of land. So then the next slide is about the full spectrum capital labs. So they call it the full spectrum labs, but it's about capital, as I said before. And they really center community stewardship. One of the projects that's listed here, it's pictured here, is a birth center equity. So you don't really necessarily think about birthing centers when you think about capital, but between the birthing center and the Big We, which is a local project in Memphis, Tennessee, they really center how do we whether it's at the hyper local level or otherwise, how do we restructure our economy in a way that again centers healing, in a way that centers wellness, in a way that centers cooperation and collectivism. And so they have been working on how that works with, with financing, how that works in terms of infrastructure, and the support, the legal support has been critical with that. And again, our same general counsel, Gilmore Kandar, the Solidarity Economy Law Firm, works with them on that. So next slide. So I want to give just a few examples of just transition lawyering, both in terms of, beyond the ones that we just talked about, but some really concrete local, hyper local examples that are shifting from, so we talk about the just transition framework, both in terms of shifting from the bad and building the new. And so in terms of shifting from the bad, this Randolph, Arizona example is a prime example. And so shifting from the bad is really shifting away from a fossil fuel economy as an example. And so we have both our larger efforts to do that, policies around shifting, actually removing subsidies for fossil fuel industry, and actually ensuring that we have subsidies for the clean energy and energy efficiency. So those are some of the larger bigger picture things, and also some of the work that was described before in terms of some of these major financial offerings that the federal government is doing to rebuild our infrastructure in a way that centers clean energy and sustainable practices. But in the meantime, community by community, people are having to fight these struggles. And the Randolph community is a historically Black town, a small, fairly under-resourced town, with significant levels of poverty, and that they have been suffering under the fact that they're adjacent to this gas plant, and that not only is the gas plant there and that they've been sickened by it, there's been just a number of challenges around deep chronic illnesses that are happening in the communities and loss of life that's happening in communities that they tie to the pollution coming from these gas plants. But the Salt River Project in Arizona has actually been pushing to expand the plant. And so there's been a pro bono lawyer working with the community, again, with the community being in the lead and the pro bono lawyer being in service to the community visions and demands. And so this is an example of just transitioning lawyering on the fighting the bad side. So the next slide talks also a little bit more about fighting on the bad side. So there's a community called in Sand Branch, Texas, where they have not had running water since the mid-80s. And there's a lot that's going on there. I mean, I could literally take up the entire rest of the presentation and talk about the dynamics there, but there are issues around the water, the 40 years of water contamination. There's no trash pickup. There is no kind of sanitation or drainage system. There's been extreme land loss. They were declared a floodplain by FEMA, even though they've never had a flood since they were established by 11 emancipated enslaved persons in 1865 and have gone to this day. But yet, because of the declaration of the FEMA floodplain, they were then subject to the FEMA buyout program, which should have been a good thing. But what it did was it kind of paved a way for developers to come in and try to get people out of the land. So there's really a notion that all of these the services that we all kind of take for granted that they do not have, there's a notion that there's kind of a concerted effort to get people out of the land. So and that's why they're being denied. They're right outside of Dallas, which is one of the richest cities in the world. So there's no shortage of resources, but those resources aren't being provided for those communities. So with the FEMA buyout program, the community, they assess the value of the land. They subtract the amount that it would cost to demolish the property on the land. And then for people who have been in these households passed down from generation to generation from the 11 emancipated persons who founded the community of Sand Branch with whatever money they were able to put together post-emancipation, they're giving people checks for $350 for those properties. That's the buying them out of those properties. So it's really land theft and just displacement of these communities. And so these are the types of things. So the Gilmore Kandahar Solidarity Economies law firm through us are working with the Sand Branch community to help them to figure out what they can do to hold on to their land, helping them to navigate negotiations with the county officials, with EPA and others to try to get water infrastructure into the community, working with institutions that are providing resources for the establishment of a local food initiative, because it is in a kind of a food insecure area. And so they're really working across multiple systems and using multiple bits of methodology, including working with the community, the Sand Branch Planning Committee, to be incorporated, which just happened. And again, they've just been with us the whole way, just providing all kinds of legal tools and advice as Sand Branch is rising and revitalizing and needs all the help it can get to do so. So next slide. So another example of just transition lawyering, and in some ways both mitigating the bad as well as trying to build a little bit of the new, but is a situation with the Los Angeles airport, LAX, and its expansion. And so there was the community that was being very much impacted by the expansion of LAX and really kind of cried foul. And so there was a lengthy negotiation where lawyers were critical to helping to develop a community benefits agreement. And so the community benefits agreement included components around noise mitigation, economic development benefits, community environmental and health studies, air quality, emissions reductions and control, and environmental mitigations and commitments for construction. So it was quite a multifaceted community benefits agreement And so these are kind of situations where often communities are fighting against whatever is happening. But when it becomes clear that it's going to happen in spite of the fight, then communities at least try to get some concessions out of it. Sometimes it might be something that the community isn't actively fighting against, but still it's a major development that's going to impact the community. And so it's a way to ensure that the communities and the developers or whomever are have kind of some clear commitments through, such as the ones that are laid out in this CBA. Next slide. So this is another network of lawyers across the world, but they are based, I mean, the organization is headquartered in South Africa, but as it says, natural justice lawyers for communities and the environment. So they work particularly around land issues, securing tenure rights, securing territorial rights for indigenous people, and really preserving ecosystems. There's right here in the United States, there's a legal coalition that is facilitated by the Unitarian Universalist sister named Salome, and it's also lawyers who are working with the Gulf region and the Biloxi, Chickamauga, Choctaw, and the Houma Nation and others in the Gulf region of Louisiana, largely around the land loss that they're experiencing because of subsidence and because of sea level rise. So they're actively being displaced from their land, and so these lawyers are working with them in a way that this coalition is also working across the country, I mean, across the world on these land rights issues. Next slide. So another example is the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization in Chicago, where I'm born and raised. And they work together with groups like Pero and also later in the campaign with the NAACP there to shut down 2 coal-fired power plants there. And again, the legal support there helped them to develop a local ordinance that they use to really center the conversation around shutting down the coal plants. So it's not just kind of this them against industry, but it actually, the local ordinance allowed for a collective process that says, what kind of air do we want to breathe? What kind of air quality standards do we want? And so in that local ordinance, it just kind of set forth the standards. And then after that, then there was negotiation with the city council to get the local ordinance passed around this type of air standards that they wanted. And then from there, it was, okay, well, now what's threatening those air quality standards that are causing, such high 40 asthma deaths and 1,000 asthma hospitalizations per year in Chicago. And then that resulted in the mayor of Chicago issuing a ultimatum to the Fisk and Crawford's coal plants to either clean them up or shut them down. And they decided that putting in air quality controls was not going to be enough to make that it was not going to be financially feasible, so they went with shutting them down. And so the community went from that to, again, having legal support to develop the new, which is establishing a local garden, establishing a food cart industry there, developing local businesses and so forth. And again, just transition lawyering was critical to the development of these initiatives. Next slide. And then another couple quick examples, the South Baltimore Community Land Trust, a community-led organization, again, supported by Just Transitioning Lawyering and putting together the Community Land Trust, all the agreements that were necessary for that and are necessary to maintain as they continue to grow from just having land collectively to then also having a local food project together collectively and so forth. So critical to have lawyering support to do so. Next slide. And so just to kind of give you a sense for those of you who might be interested in the Just Transitioning Lawyering Institute, again, it's an online training and network building program. Lawyers across the US will learn from Just Transition legal scholars, lawyers, and community organizers who will also be teachers and trainers in this. Together working on developing and broadening this field of just transition lawyers that need to be available for the thousands of communities out there that need it. Next slide. So the objectives are to gain foundational knowledge of the Just Transition Lawyering Institute, build essential skills, increase values-based connections, skills sharing and shared analysis, help to shape and communicate a proactive narrative around building the new, seed membership and participation, support building scholarship and practice on just transition lawyering practice. Next slide. And so the curriculum format, community forums, readings, activities and discussion forums, lectures and panels, small group discussions, etc. The online learning platform is called Pathright. Next slide. And then this is just a bit of the schedule. So you'll hear more. It's going to launch officially in August in terms of pulling in applications, and then we'll start the activities. And of course, CLE credits are available through this. Next slide. And this is just some of the curriculum themes for it. What is just transition, grounding and purpose, colonialism, capitalism, and climate change, because we can't have just transition within an extractive economy. Legal tools, how to keep it in the ground around extractive energies, what's disaster law and equitable recovery, the rights and risks of demanding a just transition, because it's really pushing against a very, very powerful and entrenched status quo. So there is a risk to push for dismantling capitalism and all it's involved in just transition. Next slide. Is there more? I think there is more. There is at least one more slide. Yes. So also, as I said before, once people go through the Just Transition Lawyering Institute, they become a part of the Just Transition Lawyering Network. And you don't have to go through the Institute to be a part of the network. But again, Taproot Earth is managing the network. They're building a network of lawyers to support Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and movement, leading us towards climate justice and a just transition from extractive to a living economy that's rooted in deep democracy. So that is that. I will hand it back to Christine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, for that terrific presentation. Another great presentation from one of our panelists. What I can really say is that through listening to your presentation and seeing the connection between Tanya's and Brittany's presentations, you see that environmental justice is a developing area, and it's continuing to draw interest based on the way and the speed of innovation. You hear from Tanya in the corporate sector how clients are becoming more interested, and then there's also corresponding regulations that are drawing corporations to become more aware of their rights and responsibilities in this space. And then from Brittany's perspective, you can see how affected communities will actually have the opportunity to interact and advocate for themselves based on these different corporate actions, and how as lawyers on working with both client communities, you're able to really assess and bring about progress. And with Jackie's presentation, it's really exciting to see that some of these practices, these best practices, are actually being systematized. And we're seeing that through the Just Transition Lawyering training. And you can see, I received a question in the chat about a law student who's interested in EJ work. And from the time that I was in law school to now, and maybe Brittany can attest to as well, you can see that even within the last couple of years, there's just been so much progress. And I'm just happy to be a witness and a participant in that. And I think it would be a really good time to transition over to our roundtable discussion. We've had some questions from the audience, and we've also have been able to speak a bit about federal initiatives. And so I think it'd be a nice time to transition into what some of the states are doing. I think over the past decade, we've seen the transition between administrations and the kind of proliferation on the state level of different types of legislation and programming and policy formation, and even the use of data science in terms of developing screening tools, which takes a tremendous amount of statistical and data-based research to really pull them off, make them successful tools for advocacy. So from one administration to another, we see that there has been market changes. But one constant, I believe, is that states have really been, as they say, laboratories for innovation. And I would love to hear from the panel on anything that they have seen that is particularly interesting or that they would highlight to the audience. Maybe they could spark some more research questions amongst our participants.
Sure, I can jump in. Unfortunately, in Georgia, we don't have a statewide EJ law, but I know New Jersey and New York have both fairly recently passed environmental justice statutes. And from my understanding, those statutes require permitting decisions to evaluate the impacts that the decision will have on the local community in terms of cumulative impacts and disparate impacts. And in some cases, I can't remember if both New York and New Jersey require this, but at least New York says that if there's no way to avoid disparate harm from the facility, then the permit will be denied. So I think that is a huge win. That's great progress. And I think it's also important to note that local governments can play a role as well. So if a particular state doesn't have any legislation in place, municipalities, counties, and cities can adopt ordinances or zoning laws that address some of these same issues, and in some cases require these same sorts of assessments. So I think there's a lot that state and local governments can do, even absent federal EJ legislation.
Thanks, Brittany. That's a great insight. And then also, I would encourage people, sometimes it's not called environmental justice legislation. As you mentioned, sometimes we have to look at our land use policies. We have to look at how our local zoning laws also can impact environmental justice. I spent a considerable number of years working on lead poisoning prevention policy, and those were all health laws, like related to public health. So environmental justice is really all around us, and I think it's a great time to really start looking at all the levels, like you mentioned, state and local. Thanks. That's a great question. Does anybody want to follow up with any comments? Okay, so I guess we could move on to a few other questions I have. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our panelists. A question from the audience: how do you think that we can connect the implications of state and local governments and areas where the federal government may be lacking for EJ legislation? Or maybe to shore up the question, where do you see state and local governments maybe being more able to jump in and remedy some issues that you've seen maybe in practice? Or
Yeah, I think a number of states have started to use their own mapping tools or software, and so I think that given some of the feedback with EJ Screen being perhaps ineffective or creating uncertainties, the state may be in a better position to determine sort of which communities are ones that should be captured. And so I think that is one example of how a state may be able to fill some gaps.
and that's a great example as well. So moving on, what are some of the implications you think of climate change for environmental justice work? Often I get questions from people who want to talk about climate justice, and they're more familiar with maybe environmental justice, or climate justice advocates who are not as familiar with environmental justice. Where do we see some of the linkages and opportunities here?
I guess I'll jump in first. So I think climate change has huge implications for EJ work. I mentioned during my presentation that EJ communities are often the most impacted by extreme weather events. You see in cities like Atlanta, there's heat islands where there's not a lot of tree cover, in low wealth communities of color, and that's a huge issue. We've also seen on the Georgia coast a lot of flooding in low-income communities of color. So I think there are a lot of implications that climate change will have in this space. And there's also a lot of opportunity that, again, local governments have to address some of these issues. You know, they can pass a tree ordinance related to tree canopy. They can pass flooding ordinances and strengthen their coastal resilience policies related to flooding, stormwater, wastewater infrastructure, which is often affected by rising sea levels as well. So I think there's a lot that local governments can do. And to tie back into your last question, I think sometimes local governments are in the best position to do these things because they can concentrate on one specific community, whereas, you know, as a state, there might be different solutions required for different regions, different communities, but local governments really know their communities well and are in a good position to implement some of these policies.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you. Thank you. And I would encourage all aspiring or current EJ activists or advocates to really familiarize yourself with your local, your municipal government, your representatives, because there's a wealth of issues that arise on the local level that you can really have an impact on. And so, and speaking of local, what are some ways that communities can best support and advance environmental justice? Say you're not an attorney or you don't really see yourself as an advocate, not yet at least. How can you build up and how can you help to create kind of like a culture of advocacy? Basically, EJ Advocacy 101. What tips would you give if you were going to provide some guidance to a community that might be facing an EJ issue? Okay, so I guess to be fair, I used to. Okay, sure.
I was going to leave this one for Jackie, who's sort of doing that work. But I think that typically it's important to sort of understand who the players are and understand who they are historically. And so I think there are a lot of newer organizations to the fight. And so, you know, if the website was created in 2022, maybe that's not the best place to start, but start partnering with a community organization that maybe has been around a little bit longer and sort of understands the historical legacies. And then, you know, plan your way to engage. I mean, I think it's hard to give advice without knowing the issue, but every issue is different. Every company is different. You know, it's really fact dependent, but, you know, the ability to obviously attend the public meetings and to write and to create that sort of paper trail of engagement is really important. Certainly, you don't need a law degree to create things like community engagement plans, really from the community or even business sense. Either from the business side, rather, either. And so you can partner with businesses and local government and create a plan that sort of outlines what the issues are and look at ways that they're going to be mitigated or actually addressed.
That's a great perspective. Absolutely. Definitely starting with some forms of stakeholder mapping, finding out who's at the table. And in terms of tables, I always encourage people interested in this type of advocacy that all voices are needed and appreciated, and having lived experience is important, but just having empathy for what's going on can really help you to ask the right kinds of questions and provide the right kind of support. So that's definitely a great start.
One thing I would add too, I think that COVID in some ways helped. Well, at least I'd heard from people actively engaged, particularly at the government level, with things like public notice and comment, that COVID in some ways helped make a shift in terms of our not being able to obviously assemble in a place together. And so people had to think a little bit differently as to what you know, that public notice and public process looked like. And so hopefully that has continued after COVID to include communities, for example, where, you know, driving 45 minutes to a meeting on a weeknight may pose difficulty, or having to take public transit to get there may pose difficulty, that we can imagine new and creative ways to solicit that feedback and make sure that it's documented.
That is so true, Tanya, because if you think about it, accessibility matters often were difficult for people who would say working in the middle of the day and then there's a hearing.
Right.
And having hearings by Zoom, or having enhanced public participation through websites, and then even making sure that those websites are sufficiently and accessible, has really helped to bolster and encourage people to get involved. So there's definitely an important shift, I think, from COVID. And hopefully if that continues, we can continue really cultivating more robust public involvement. And so, and speaking, I guess, on public involvement, let's see if we can provide our audience with some kind of tips and pointers for best practices as environmental justice lawyering becomes more of a sub part of environmental law. Can we spend some time maybe talking about best practices? I think that would really help the audience to kind of take away some of the historic, practical, and then maybe, professional tips from our presentation today.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about this in my presentation, but in addition to building community trust by just listening to what the community has to say and really prioritizing their needs and their goals in this work, I think it's important to recognize also something that Christine and Tanya were talking about, which is, accessibility and timing can be a really big consideration. So if people are working during working hours, you might have to show up to a meeting after hours and be available kind of when the community needs you. And I think that's definitely a best practice in terms of showing up and really demonstrating your support for the community in the ways that they need it.
Yeah, I really push my business clients to be more creative and imaginative, and so it's really, I think, an interesting time, and it's so nice to see so many people in the chat express interest in these issues, because I do think it is going to create in career, and I mean it already has resulted in creation of career growth and technological growth, right? So we talked a bit earlier about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And so, particularly for scope 3 emissions that are going to sort of assess a company's value chain, the way that it's interacting, emissions associated with its interactions with suppliers and consumers, we're going to have to create technologies to sort of measure these things. And then we're going to need people to audit them to make sure that what we're saying is accurate, right, and can be verified. And so that's another job. And so there are a lot, I think, a lot of ways that people can help sort of outside of just looking at the legal frameworks, although we need people on that end as well. But there, I think, going to be a lot of creative opportunities for people to partner and get involved. And so, and thinking of strategy, looking at technologies that perhaps can reduce some of these burdens, really irrespective of whether the community is the EJ community or not, right? How can we think of ways to work more efficiently and smarter, and continue that engagement? So I think it's a great time for creative people who are solutions driven to work on solving some of these issues.
Yes, I think it definitely demands all the points that you've raised, and I appreciate your insight on that. So as we get towards the end of our 2 hours together, what are some ways that you see, I guess this question is for Tanya and also for you, Brittany, what are some of the ways you see consumers or regular folks, who are in the marketplace impacting this discussion or driving this discussion on environmental justice? Maybe from the corporate perspective, and then for Brittany, maybe you could talk about the public interest side.
Yeah, I mean, somebody had a question in the chat about the regenerative and circular economy, and I think there's been certainly a rash of litigation in the ESG space related to the recyclability of plastics and plastic pollution. And, what does it mean when a company says that something is 100% recyclable? Is that, actually a thing? And I think that predominantly was the driver, along with a lot of the climate litigation, and some of the climate litigation particularly, I think maybe was to establish precedent. I'm not sure necessarily that plaintiffs were initially concerned about outcome, but a lot of that litigation proceeding in state court now, and we're going to get to formulate a new body of law. But the litigation, I think, is kind of evolving outside of that, into other consumer goods and services, and then the way that they're marketed. I think we're going to see more of that, particularly how things are marketed to particular communities. I was on a FTC public meeting, and someone presented about the need to reform the green guides and how particular products are marketed specifically to African American communities, for example, like chemical hair straighteners, and they're marketed as having positive health benefits or no environmental impact, and there's data that proves that perhaps is not the case. So I think that it's certainly evolving in ways that couldn't have been foreseen, but maybe things that we don't traditionally think about as environmental justice. There was also a question too, I think somebody had a really good question about sort of incorporation of indigenous knowledge and all of this. And I think that there is a place for that, particularly when you talk about things like regenerative agriculture. And we have an administration now that I think is still working on policy, but has expressed an interest in wanting to incorporate cultural understanding and indigenous knowledge in some of its decision making and policy. And so that, I think, is going to change many ways in which federal agencies make decisions about how, for example, federal land may be used. We've seen the Bureau of Land Management issue a proposed rule that would elevate sort of conservation on par with other industry uses of public land. So I think that it's really an exciting time from that perspective, but I think that the envelope is open, and things are changing very swiftly, and there are many ways to sort of recharacterize many of these issues that we're seeing it more in litigation and on the policy front as well.
Thank you, Tanya. That's a great response. And on my end, I encouraged my students to submit comments when the FTC was soliciting for comments to the Green Guide. And it's just explaining to people that by your participation in the market itself, you have a reason to speak up. You have a reason to really have your concerns validated, and submitting comments is a very helpful way for people to really express their concern, and also to realize how much a part of this we all really are, and that this isn't really removed from you, because regulation truly touches each and every aspect of our lives. So getting involved is different, and also requires some creativity. But I'd like to welcome back Jackie, and in the time that we have, probably tap some questions for her expertise. You have a great background in history and shaping and developing communities in the space. And perhaps maybe I could send our last question that I have here is, what do you hope for the future of environmental justice advocacy? And we can start with Jackie and then move on to the rest of our panelists.
Yeah, I think I'm obviously biased with Just Transition. I really, I really like to see environmental justice advocacy in its kind of traditional form to become less necessary, because we have changed the broader systems that have made environmental justice advocacy so necessary now. So I'd like to see where we have shifted away from an investor-owned utility model and a fossil fuel economy into a more regenerative energy model. I'd like to see us shift away from big ag and the ways that we have harmful food production to more localized food production. I'd like to see, I'd like to see us shift away from what we see now is increasing water privatization because the intersection of climate and drought and water scarcity and people capitalizing on that in the way of capitalism. And so I'd like to see us kind of marry those while we're stopping the bad, that we have the type of transformational systemic shifts that are necessary to really normalize the good in terms of a regenerative economy. That's what I would love to see. Oh, you're on mute, Christine. Christine, you're on mute. Oops, can you hear me? Okay, you're on mute. There you are. Now you're not on mute.
But I agree with you. Hopefully we can away from some of the issues in terms of looking back, knowing we made significant progress in some of the tools that we've relied on are no longer necessary because we've reached solutions to some of those problems. But I feel like I really learned a lot from my panelists, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone today. And I think in our last minute, any closing thoughts? But I just want to express a great appreciation for everyone, our participants on the panel, and especially all of our attendees.
Thank you, Christine.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much to Christine, Jackie, Tanya, and Brittany for speaking at today's program. We so appreciate your time and energy preparing for this webinar. Environmental justice is such an important subject to discuss right now, so we're grateful you joined us to speak with our audience about it. To our audience, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for attending our summer school series since this is the last webinar of summer school for 2023. Whether you attended today only or attended each session this summer, we at ELI are excited that you're interested in environmental law and grateful for your time and engagement. We've seen a lot of engagement this year, so we're particularly thankful to you all. If you're a student, please remember that you can join ELI as a member for free. We encourage you to continue attending other programming throughout the fall. This applies to any students, whether you're an undergraduate student, law student, anyone who's a student is welcome to join. If you're an attorney and you're interested in getting a deeper understanding of environmental law at a little bit of a deeper level than summer school offers, we encourage you to sign up for Eastern or Western Bootcamp, which is a 3-day intensive training that ELI holds each year. Each year we hold Eastern Bootcamp based out of DC in the fall and Western Bootcamp based out of a city in the on the West Coast each spring. We already held Western Bootcamp this year, but we will be holding Eastern Bootcamp this fall, probably in November. Registration is not yet available for Eastern Bootcamp, but it should be later this summer, so please stay tuned for that. You can find information about ELI membership, Eastern and Western boot camps, and all other events on eli.org. Please feel free to reach out to me at calhoun@eli.org with any questions at all. For those of you in the DMV area, please join back at 12 p.m. Eastern next Thursday at ELI's office in Washington, D.C. for our last event of summer school, which, as a reminder, will now be a networking reception. The website is updated now, so you can find the registration link. We've posted it in the chat, but it's also available on our website. If you registered for the previous Hazardous Waste Insights event, you do not need to register again. So just a big thank you once again to our wonderful speakers and to our audience, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you all.